There's a reason this keeps happening to you, and no one really explains it in a way that makes sense to your nervous system. You meet someone who feels distant but magnetic, calm but unreadable, present but never fully reachable. And the more you lean in, the more they seem to slip through your fingers. It makes you question your value, your timing, your words, even your worth. But here's the truth that changes everything. Avoidant people don't get hooked by affection, intensity, or effort. They get hooked by a feeling so rare, so unfamiliar, that when they experience it, even once, it imprints. And once it imprints, they don't forget it. Not because they want to be obsessed with you, but because their nervous system remembers what it felt like to finally exhale around someone. This isn't about tricks. It's not about playing hard to get or pretending not to care. It's about creating one specific emotional state that bypasses every wall they've ever built. And when that state happens, something inside them clicks. This is the moment everything shifts. This is the moment they stop running from connection and start moving toward it without realizing why. And if you've ever felt like you almost had them, like there was a version of them that only came out around you, this is why. Because you were close to making them feel the one thing they rarely ever feel with another human being. Most people misunderstand the avoidant behavior at a surface level. They say avoidants don't want love, don't value relationships, don't care deeply. That's the biggest lie in this entire space. Avoidant people feel deeply, sometimes more deeply than anyone else in the room. But they learned early on that depth came with a cost, that closeness meant pressure, that needing someone meant losing themselves. So instead of turning off their emotions, they learned to control access to them. They learned how to want without reaching, how to care without depending, how to connect without surrendering. From the outside, it looks like indifference. From the inside, it feels like survival, and that's why traditional advice fails so hard with them. All the things that work on emotionally open people backfire here. More reassurance feels like expectation. More affection feels like obligation. More pursuit feels like danger. You're not being rejected because you're not enough. You're being resisted because their nervous system is trained to protect autonomy at all costs. And the second you're perceived as someone who might need them emotionally, their system tightens. Not because you're wrong, but because their body doesn't feel safe. This is where most people accidentally sabotage themselves. They sense the distance and try to close it. They feel the shift and ask for clarity. They notice the pullback and offer more love, more availability, more proof, and every one of those moves, even when they come from a pure place, sends the same unconscious message to an avoidant nervous system. You are now responsible for my emotional state. That message doesn't register logically, it registers physically. Their chest tightens, their thoughts scatter, their desire fades, and then they tell themselves a story to justify the retreat. They say they're not ready. They say the connection isn't right. They say something feels off. But what actually feels off is the loss of internal freedom. Avoidance don't run from love. They run from emotional gravity that pulls without permission. The moment someone starts orbiting them, they feel trapped, and the more intense the pull, the faster they detach. Here's the part no one tells you. Avoidants are not addicted to people. They're addicted to emotional states. They don't miss faces as much as they miss how they felt in certain moments. They don't long for presence. They long for regulation, calm, space, control, relief, safety, without dependence. When they connect with someone who allows them to feel all of that at once, it creates confusion because it contradicts everything they learned about closeness. They were taught that intimacy equals pressure, that being chosen means being needed, that love comes with expectations they can't meet. So when they meet someone who enjoys them without leaning on them, who chooses them without clinging, who is emotionally available without being emotionally dependent, their system doesn't know how to categorize it. There's no alarm, no urgency to pull away, just a quiet sense of ease, and that ease is rare. that ease is addictive. This is where the real shift begins. Because the one feeling that hooks an avoidant for life isn't passion or chemistry or even love in the way most people define it. It's the experience of being fully chosen without being required to perform, fix, rescue, or regulate another person's emotions. It's being wanted without being needed, being appreciated without being depended on, being close without being consumed. For an avoidant, this feels almost unreal, like walking into a room and realizing the air is finally breathable. There's no role to play, no expectation to meet, no emotional debt accumulating with every interaction. Just presence, just connection, just space to themselves without consequence. And once they feel that, even once, their system marks it as safe, not exciting in a chaotic way, but soothing in a way that rewires how they understand intimacy. When someone creates this feeling, avoidants don't always react immediately. In fact, they often do the opposite. They get quieter. They pull back slightly. Not because they're losing interest, but because something unfamiliar just landed inside them. Their system is recalibrating. They're trying to understand why they don't feel the usual urge to escape, why they don't feel drained, why they don't feel pressured. And this is where most people misread the moment and panic. They think the distance means disinterest. They think the silence means rejection, so they reach. And the reaching collapses the very space that made the feeling possible. The paradox is brutal, but real. The feeling that makes an avoidant stay is the same feeling most people destroy by trying to secure it. Avoidants protect one thing above everything else: control over their emotional exposure, not control over you, control over themselves. They learned that once someone gets too close, the cost is too high, so they monitor intimacy constantly. They track how much is expected of them, how much energy is required, how much of themselves they're giving away. And when that internal meter spikes, they deactivate. They don't announce it. They don't always understand it consciously. They just feel the urge to retreat. But when they're with someone who doesn't spike that meter, something extraordinary happens. Their guard doesn't need to be up. Their system stays regulated. And because there's no threat, their curiosity stays alive. They start wondering. They start noticing. They start remembering how they feel around you. Calm, clear, unburdened. And that's when attachment begins, quietly, privately, without drama. This is also why chasing never works. Chasing turns connection into a transaction. It creates imbalance. It says, even without words, I need you to respond a certain way so I can feel okay. For avoidance, that's the fastest way to shut down attraction, not because they don't care, but because their body associates that dynamic with suffocation. They don't want to be the source of someone else's emotional stability. They want to be chosen freely, not leaned on. And when they meet someone who already feels whole, already feels grounded, already feels emotionally complete, it flips a switch. Because now connection feels optional instead of obligatory. An optional connection is the only kind that feels safe to them. The moment they feel this, something subtle but powerful happens. They start thinking about you when you're not there. Not in an anxious way, not in an obsessive way, but in a reflective way. They replay interactions. They notice how relaxed they felt, how natural it was, how there was no pressure to be more or less than who they are. They don't announce this. They don't chase it. They don't even label it. But their nervous system remembers. And every time they enter another dynamic that feels demanding or heavy or emotionally loud, the contrast becomes obvious. Nothing feels as clean. Nothing feels as quiet. Nothing feels as safe. And that's when the imprint deepens. This is why you never have to force an avoidant to attach. You don't convince them. You don't argue them into clarity. You don't prove your worth. You simply become the place where their system feels free and connected at the same time. And that combination is so rare that once they experience it, it becomes the reference point. Even if they leave, even if they disappear, even if they try to recreate it elsewhere, their body knows the difference, and they will always remember the one person who made closeness feel like relief instead of responsibility. What you're really doing here isn't making someone addicted to you. You're allowing them to experience a version of intimacy that doesn't threaten their identity. You're showing them that connection doesn't have to mean loss of self. And when an avoidant feels that once deeply, without pressure, without expectation, without fear, it changes how they bond forever. Not because you trapped them, but because you gave them something their system had never known before. And once that door opens, it never fully closes again. And once that door opens, something inside them starts rearranging itself quietly. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way they announce or even fully understand. It's subtle, almost invisible, but it's permanent because the next phase isn't about what you do around them. It's about what starts happening inside them when you're not there. This is where the rare feeling begins to rewire their attachment patterns without force, without pressure, without strategy. They don't suddenly become expressive or chase you openly. That's not how avoidant systems work. Instead, they become internally tethered. They carry the emotional state you created like a reference point, and that reference point starts influencing every decision they make, even when they swear they're independent and unaffected. The rare feeling that rewires an avoidant isn't excitement, it isn't butterflies, it isn't obsession. It's something much quieter and much deeper. It's the experience of emotional safety without emotional obligation. For most people, safety comes from reassurance, from consistency, from knowing where they stand. For avoidance, safety comes from knowing they won't be trapped, that they won't be expected to give more than they have, that they won't be required to manage another person's inner world. When they feel safe in that way, their system relaxes instead of bracing. Their mind stays present instead of scanning for exits. And when that happens, they don't need to deactivate. They don't need to disappear. They don't need to protect themselves from you. You become the one place where closeness doesn't feel like danger. And once an avoidant experiences that, their body memorizes it. And this is the part people rarely see. On the outside, it can look like nothing is happening. Conversations stay light. Interactions stay calm. There's no dramatic escalation. No emotional confessions, no sudden shift into intensity. But internally, the avoidant is noticing something unsettling. They're noticing that they don't feel the urge to pull away. They're noticing that time around you doesn't drain them. They're noticing that silence doesn't feel awkward or demanding. They can just and for someone who has spent their entire life managing distance, that feels unfamiliar in the best and scariest way, because now their usual defense mechanisms don't activate. And when defenses go in, attachment has space to form. This is also why this feeling short circuits their usual deactivation cycle. Normally, as soon as closeness increases, their system sends warning signals. They start focusing on flaws. They intellectualize their emotions. They convince themselves the connection isn't right. That process protects them from vulnerability. But when the closeness is paired with freedom, those warning signals don't fire. There's nothing to escape from. There's no emotional demand pressing against their boundaries. So instead of shutting down, they stay curious. And curiosity is dangerous territory for an avoidant, because curiosity keeps them engaged. It keeps them present. It keeps them thinking about you when they're alone. And that's when the internal low begins. They start replaying moments without realizing it. The way you didn't react when they needed space. The way you didn't ask for more when they pulled back. The way you seemed grounded in yourself instead of waiting on them to define the connection. These moments don't feel intense. They feel relieving. And relief is the most underrated bonding agent for an avoidant. Relief tells their nervous system, you are not a threat. You are not another responsibility. You are not something I have to manage. You are simply someone I can exist near without losing myself. And once that association forms, it's incredibly hard to break. This is usually the point where they start thinking about you in private, not texting you constantly, not reaching out impulsively, but holding you in mind, wondering how you're doing without asking, feeling a quiet pull without acting on it. Avoidance process attachment internally first. They don't Externalize it until it feels safe. So while you might think nothing is happening, something very real is unfolding beneath the surface. Their internal world is slowly reorganizing around the feeling you gave them, and the more they encounter other connections that feel loud, demanding, or emotionally heavy, the more your presence stands out in contrast. Here's where most people ruin this without knowing it. They sense the shift, they feel the connection deepening, and they try to lock it in. They ask for clarity, they push for labels, they seek reassurance, and that instantly changes the emotional state. What was once free becomes conditional, what was once spacious becomes narrow, and the avoidance system reacts immediately. Not because they don't care, but because the safety just disappeared. The feeling that hooked them relied on one thing above all else: the absence of pressure. The moment pressure enters, the spell breaks, and this is why this power can never be announced. It can never be demanded. It can never be rushed. It only exists when it's allowed to unfold naturally. The truth is, avoidance can sense strategy. They're hyper aware of emotional undercurrents. If they feel like someone is withholding on purpose or pulling away to provoke a response, their guard goes up. This isn't about distance as a tactic, it's about emotional independence as a state of being. There's a massive difference. Emotional independence isn't cold, it isn't detached, it's warm, present, and grounded. It says, I enjoy you, but I don't need you to regulate my emotions. And that energy is magnetic to an avoidant because it removes the fear of enmeshment. It allows them to approach connection at their own pace without feeling chased. When you embody this, something flips. The avoidant starts moving toward you instead of away. Slowly, subtly, then ways that don't always look romantic at first. They linger longer in conversations. They share slightly more than usual. Their tone softens. They check in without a clear reason. These are emotional bids, even if they don't look like it. And the more these bids are met without pressure, the safer they feel. Safety deepens attachment, not excitement, not intensity, not chemistry alone. Safety layered with freedom creates a bond that doesn't trigger escape. This is also where emotional independence becomes the source of gravity. When you're not trying to pull them closer, they feel space to come closer on their own. And that choice matters deeply to an avoidant. Choice preserves autonomy. Choice keeps their nervous system regulated. When they choose connection freely, without coercion, it doesn't feel like a loss of self. It feels like an expansion. And that's the moment attachment shifts from avoidance to curiosity to desire. There's a common misconception that avoidants only respond to distance, that you have to pull away to make them chase. That's not true. Distance without emotional grounding feels like abandonment. Emotional independence with presence feels safe. The difference is massive. One triggers defenses, the other disarms them. When you're emotionally stable, consistent, and self-contained, you don't need to disappear to be attractive. Your calm becomes the pull. Your lack of urgency becomes the invitation, and avoidants respond to that in ways they often don't expect themselves. As this continues, the emotional imprint deepens. They start associating you with regulation, with peace, with clarity, with the absence of chaos. And because avoidants often live in their heads, constantly monitoring emotional risk, that sense of peace becomes incredibly valuable. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel like falling in love in the movies. It feels like coming home to quiet. And once that association forms, it's hard to replace, even if they try, even if they distance themselves, even if they rationalize their way out of it. Their body remembers. This is why the bond doesn't need constant reinforcement. You don't have to be always available. You don't have to prove anything. The feeling speaks for itself, and the more you trust it, the stronger it becomes. Because trust communicates safety, and safety is the language an avoidant nervous system understands best. At this stage, something important also happens inside you. You stop waiting. You stop overanalyzing. You stop tying your worth to their behavior. And that internal shift is what actually sustains the dynamic. Because the moment you stop needing an outcome, the connection becomes lighter, and lighter connections are the ones avoidants stay in. Not because they're shallow, but because they're sustainable. This is the paradox that changes everything. The less you try to secure the avoidant, the safer they feel with you. The safer they feel, the more they attach. And the more they attach, the more consistent they become. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, authentically, on their terms. And that's the only way an avoidant bond lasts. What you're creating here isn't dependence, it's resonance. You're not making them addicted to you as a person. You're becoming the emotional environment their system prefers, and environments are powerful. People leave environments that feel stressful. They return to environments that feel regulating over and over again, sometimes without understanding why. By the time you reach this point, you'll notice something surprising. You're no longer trying to make them stay. You're no longer afraid of losing them because you know the truth now. If they've felt this with you once, really felt it, it's already part of them. They may wander, they may test other connections, but they will always compare, and nothing compares to a connection that feels free and safe at the same time. And, that's the real shift. Not control, not attachment through fear, but a bond built on emotional freedom. One that doesn't demand loyalty, yet creates it. One that doesn't ask for commitment, yet inspires it. One that doesn't chase, yet is remembered. This is how avoidants attach for life. Not loudly, not desperately, but deeply, quietly, permanently. And once the bond reaches this point, something even more unexpected begins to happen. The dynamic no longer feels like push and pull. It no longer feels like guessing games or emotional chess. Instead, it starts to feel quiet in a way that might almost scare you at first. Because for so long, intensity was how you measured connection. Anxiety meant you cared. Confusion meant it mattered. But now, there's a steadiness that replaces all of that, and that steadiness is exactly what allows an avoidant to stay emotionally present without panicking. This is where most people misinterpret what's happening and accidentally sabotage it. They assume calm means boredom. They assume peace means fading interest. But for an avoidant, peace is the doorway to deeper attachment. This is also where the difference between distance and detachment becomes crucial. Distance is physical or emotional space that still holds connection underneath it. Detachment is withdrawal without care. Avoidants need distance the way other people need reassurance. It's how they regulate. When distance is respected without resentment, it doesn't weaken the bond, it strengthens it. Because now the avoidant doesn't have to choose between closeness and safety. They get both. And that combination is rare enough to feel almost unreal. They can step back without being punished. They can go quiet without being interrogated. They can return without having to repair damage. And every time that cycle completes safely, trust deepens. This is when you'll notice something subtle but powerful. The avoidance starts initiating in their own way. Not always with words, sometimes with presence, sometimes with consistency, sometimes with small acts that don't look romantic on the surface, but carry emotional weight. They remember details, they follow up later, they show up when it actually matters. These are signs of bonding in an avoidance system, not grand gestures, not emotional declarations, but reliability without pressure. And the reason this happens is simple. Their nervous system now associates you with safety, and safety allows desire to grow instead of shutting down. This stage, the emotional imprint you leave becomes unmistakable. It's no longer just about how they feel when they're with you. It's about how they feel when they're away from you. Not anxious, not empty, but slightly more regulated, knowing you exist, knowing the connection is there without demand. That's an incredibly grounding experience for someone who has spent their life keeping emotional doors half closed. You become a stable reference point, not a lifeline, not a crutch, a reference, and references shape behavior quietly over time. This is also why avoidants often return long after a connection ends. Not because they miss conversations, not because they're lonely, but because their body remembers the emotional environment you created. They remember how it felt to be themselves without being managed or misunderstood. They remember how there was no pressure to be more or less than who they were. And once they've experienced that, it becomes the baseline. Other connections start to feel noisy, demanding, unsettling. Even if those connections look good on paper, even if they involve people who are emotionally available in traditional ways, availability without safety doesn't work for an avoidant. It just triggers withdrawal. This is also where the biggest mistake happens. The moment the avoidant starts moving closer, the urge to secure them kicks in. You might feel tempted to ask where things are going, to define the relationship, to finally get reassurance. And that urge makes sense. You've been through inconsistency. You want clarity. You want stability. But here's the truth that protects everything you've built. For an avoidant, pressure at the wrong time doesn't just slow progress, it reverses it. The bond survives because it feels chosen, not demanded. The second it feels like an expectation, their system reads danger. This doesn't mean you abandon your needs. It means you time them with emotional intelligence. Avoidants open when they feel safe, not when they feel cornered. When you rush the process, you collapse the space that allowed attachment to form in the first place. And the irony is, the more secure you feel within yourself, the less urgent those questions become. You stop needing answers to feel okay, and that internal shift is felt immediately by the avoidant. They relax, they lean in more, because now they're not carrying the weight of your uncertainty on top of their own. This is also where loyalty starts to emerge without control. Avoidants don't respond well to obligation, but they respond deeply to choice. When they choose you freely, over and over again, it creates a bond that's stronger than any promise, because it's rooted in autonomy.